In the beginning, there was nothing, not even a single thing, not even nothingness. In the single moment of the instantaneous creation of all things, nothingness became aware that it was non-existent. The moment it became aware that it was non-existent, all things came into existence. Welcome to the Real Spiritual Gangster podcast. I'm your host, Brian Wenzel, and today I want to talk to you about my spiritual life. And just to kind of set the record straight on this podcast, my intention for some of the first episodes is really to lay a foundation. So when I try to bring people onto the podcast, for example, if I brought some kind of a hip-hop artist or something like that on the podcast, I might ask them to go listen to the episode about an introduction to my gang life. Likewise, if I brought somebody on who's a spiritual teacher or something like that, I might ask them to listen to this podcast, an introduction to my spiritual life. So with that in mind, I often just kind of want to clarify, like, the exact people I'm trying to clarify subject matter to, and then I sort of anticipate and hope to have other people sort of be an audience to that and observe and watch and listen to me have this communication with them. So that in mind, let me just get right into it. In the previous episode before this, I basically introduced my gang life first. I thought that was a little more relevant, just because it's this thing that seems to be more odd, more curious for people. I think people seem to be fascinated with gang life and gang culture and organized crime and the mafia and all this kind of stuff. It's something that just seems to intrigue Americans. So I felt like that was really the original foundation I needed to lay to just create that clarity first. But now, on the total flip side of the same coin, I want to explain how throughout this journey, the entire time I was doing all this really intense, crazy stuff that average normal people probably don't usually partake in or even come across, that I was guided by certain spiritual principles along the way, and I was attuned to something greater than myself. I wasn't always just led by, some kind of ignorant, naive, self-destructive tendency or something like that. There actually was an intent that was there that might not have been easily recognized on the surface, but inside myself, I was being moved by something greater. So I think the easiest place to kind of start this journey is, in the previous podcast I had explained, I'll just quickly recap in case listeners of this episode didn't listen to the previous episode. I explained in my gang life that I was born into the largest bust of organized crime in U.S. history, the true story of what the movie Casino is about. My father was an attorney working with John Balistreri, who was also an attorney, and his father was Frank Balistreri. Frank Balistreri was essentially the boss of bosses in the true story that the movie Casino is about, that had organized all the Midwest bosses to fund a casino operation. And then all these mob bosses were skimming the casino and sending duffel bags of money back, to these bosses. And they eventually get busted for, skimming the money from the casino and tax evasion, all this other stuff. And so I was born into that. And in the backdrop of that story, while the FBI and Interpol and all this stuff is coming at all different times of day and questioning our family and even honestly at times even kidnapping some of us and questioning us in isolation. I was only a child, so I wasn't a part of any of that. I was somewhere between the ages of 2 and 4 or something like that, very young. So I do remember some of the chaos, but obviously I wasn't a subject matter to be questioned. I was just a little kid. But there was all this chaos, and in the midst of this chaos, my mother eventually leaves my father and flees to find sanctuary with her mother, who lived in Sedona, Arizona, and was a minister of the Unity Church. So I think from that right there, you can see a correlation of why this podcast is called the Real Spiritual Gangster Podcast. From the earliest moments in my life, my earliest memories, I basically came in to one extreme and then went all the way to the other, and that was sort of my foundation. And then I just lived out my entire life walking between these two polarities. So for those of you who don't know, Sedona is an extremely beautiful place, probably one of the most beautiful places in the entire world, and it's known as the New Age capital of the world, and they're into UFOs and astrology and psychics and all this kind of stuff, all kinds of New Age stuff. But there is also plenty of Christian churches and lots of people into yoga and all kinds of other stuff too, and Buddhism. So it has a pretty wide range of things people are into. But all in all, it's a very open-minded, spiritually activated place. And so this is where I pretty much grew up. I grew up between Sedona, Arizona, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for the most part. And my grandma was always exposing us to these really rich, intimate spiritual teachings that sort of make you really take an inventory and take personal responsibility for yourself and your life and everything in it. Anyone who's ever heard of a book called The Course in Miracles, that was something that she was kind of into. And one of the things that she taught me when I was very young, and this teaching is kind of what carried me through all the gang activity and everything I ever got myself involved in. It was all pretty much driven from this one comment that she made to me. And what she said was, there's only two things in this world, love and fear, and one of them is an illusion. And from that riddle, I basically set out to prove that fear was an illusion and love is all that there was. So I kind of just ran straight towards everything that I was fearful of. And as a young male, going through adolescence, going from age 8, 9, 10, 11, into junior high, and there's sort of this rite of passage that I feel like men go through, and it starts pretty early. It starts basically in junior high, and I wasn't. I don't know. I don't even know how to qualify where I'm going with this, but basically, I was warned that there was going to be gangs by the time we got to high school, at our high school, and I just kind of knew that there was this threat and this rite of passage we all had to go through, and that going into high school was going to be a part of that rite of passage, and especially for young men, you kind of get either picked on, bullied, you get in fights, or seniors try to dominate you and throw you in trash cans, and there's all this rite of passage stuff that you go through. And I think I had kind of been already a little bit exposed to some of this gang stuff, and so just kind of knowing that it was coming, I was more, I think, on edge and ready to run straight into it. And admittedly, I think a lot of it was based in fear and trying to face the fear head on and just go straight in. And so anyway, basically this teaching of there's only two things in this world, love and fear, and one of them is an illusion, is kind of one of the guiding principles that took me through everything. And where it ended up taking me was, it really is probably going to be important to listen to the previous podcast to understand the journey that I took up to this moment where I'm now going to pick up from. So I had kind of took you guys through a journey explaining how I had been through all this gang-related stuff, and then I moved to Tucson and got involved in Southside Sereños, and they basically were ultimately connected to the Mexican Mafia, because that's what Sereños is. It's a truce between Mexican Mafia and the Crips, and I didn't actually truthfully spend that much time with them in the end. In hindsight, I mean, I kind of evolved quickly out of that as well. And I'd explained in the previous podcast that I sort of learned a lot about drug culture and this corridor between Tucson and El Paso, where at times and upwards of 80% of all the drugs in the country was flowing. So basically, I just kind of, in many ways, moved up the ranks. I mean, started at like a base level, just gang banging, being crazy, trying to sell drugs, like just this whole egotistical trying to be tough and cool and show off and all this, to very quickly realizing once I had moved to Tucson that their culture was literally probably the exact opposite of like most of what you see in hip hop culture. I mean, showing off, bragging, like having all this jewelry and just kind of like externally showing how much money you have. It was basically the exact opposite. Everybody actually was the man, and everybody didn't want you to know. And so what I learned in my time living in Tucson was basically how to become super successful by being humble and keeping your mouth shut. And that was, I don't even know how to put a lot of context on this, but it was just extremely transformative and really turned me into who I am today, and gave me an angle and a depth that I wish was portrayed in hip hop culture, which is that people don't realize, you look at hip hop culture and it's basically the common denominator is a feeling of oppression and overcoming like a feeling of like being in the struggle and like overcoming that. And in my mind, how could everybody not relate to that? Because that's like storytelling 101. Act 1 introduce the characters, Act 2 introduce the problem or challenge to be overcome, Act 3 the resolution. Everybody loves an underdog, and I mean, especially in American, the underdog is like the cliche American story. I mean, the colonists were the underdog against the British Empire, and we won and defeated them. And slaves were the underdog and overcame that. The civil rights movement, minorities were the underdog and overcame that. And hip hop is sort of like kind of the final flowering and fruiting of reconciling all of our hypocrisy, and the underdog like coming to the forefront and winning. But I feel like it's a story that everybody can understand, and that's why that's why everybody feels it. That's why it affects the whole world. That's why middle class white America was buying a huge portion of all the album sales when when rap became as big as it is. And I'm going to get into the politics. I mean, I had a natural knack for understanding gang politics at a very early age, and I was able to navigate my way through really intense worlds that I could pretty much tell you, like, almost nobody I've ever met in my life was able to walk between as many worlds as I walked through. And being a part of this culture and being friends with people all over the world, all over the country, living in this same culture, I learned a lot. And one of the things that I think differentiated me from a lot of the people I was interacting with and a lot of the really intense gangbanging and drug cartels and all this kind of like really intense energy I was around was that I was always looking for that common denominator of who is the oppressor? Who is oppressing us? Like, why is this happening? Why are we in this struggle? Like, what is the source of this struggle? And so this is kind of the spiritual journey I was on, and always being led by, there's only two things in this world, love and fear, and one of them's an illusion. So I was just always running head first into looking for the answer and getting involved in this world and this reality and this culture and traveling a lot, moving around the world a lot. I came to basically have a deep appreciation for cannabis, and really got to see how big of a global movement cannabis was. This is back in the 90s and early 2000s. And in Tucson, it's like you have all these different levels of people selling weed, and you have like your little low level. I mean, even low level people are basically moving pounds. I mean, nobody's like, I don't even know if I know anybody that was like, selling nickel bags or something like that. That's like a city thing. That's like an East Coast thing. That doesn't even happen. Your lowest level people are basically selling pounds, and your average person who's like a veteran who's been in it for 5 years or 10 years, somebody who's like kind of been in it for a while, they're most likely moving hundreds of pounds, and that's just basically how it works. And then people that are really committed and are really all in, you're working with drug cartels, and you're basically moving 2,000 pounds at a time. You're dealing in tonnage, and this is something I wish. I wish there was more storytelling around it. I wish there was more storytelling. I wish there was more music based on this. I wish that this culture had a chance to show itself to the world. But the reality is that it's made its impact by being hidden, by being secret, by being unknown, by nobody knowing that it exists. And, this is a culture that I come out of. And I basically want to help have a positive impact on the world. I want to have a positive impact in spirituality. I want to have a positive impact in politics. I want to have a positive impact in gang politics. I want to have a positive impact in hip-hop culture. And I'm coming from a culture that I don't think anyone knows exists. And what that culture is there is a culture of white people who are able to move between the races and the cultures and traffic huge amounts of drugs, like basically all the drugs in the country. And of course, there's a lot of, Mexicans and blacks that are involved in this trade. But in Arizona, in the prisons, I mean, if you're really connected to gang culture, prison culture, drug trafficking culture, you would know that in the Mexican culture, a lot of them don't trust black people. Like, I know a lot of Mexicans that traffic a lot of drugs that would never do business with black people. And they have it in their head that they can't trust black people and that black people will rob you. And that's basically why they won't do business with them. And what that does is it creates this huge opportunity for white people to be the traffickers. So it's very common, obviously everyone's trying to get it every way they can, and everyone's looking for a connection, and everyone's looking for a buyer, and everyone, in this world, everyone's just doing everything they can. But there's a very strong element of white people who comfortably can go to Mexico, who can speak a little bit of Spanish, who can, win over the trust of these people and can move that to, anywhere in the country and give it to other white people, or, bring it to the hood and sell it, to Mexicans and blacks in the other end of the country. And there's a thing where it's just easier for white people to traffic the drugs. They just are less profiled. They're more camouflaged at looking like they're normal. It's just easier to look like you're just some ordinary school teacher, or you're a plumber, or you're whatever. And it's very difficult to read between the lines and know that those people are up to something. And so anyway, I went really deep into this world, into understanding what's really going on, how the world works, like how much drugs is actually being trafficked. And obviously it's a lot. Anyone who's ever, seen documentaries or, watched the movie Traffic or Blow or anything, we are a drug hungry country, and all the drugs in the world are trying to get here because we're the largest market. And a lot of that was all getting funneled through, the Tucson, El Paso corridor being trafficked by the Sinaloan cartel. And, just being a part of this culture, I personally became super passionate about cannabis and understanding, what is its role in the world? What is its role politically? What's really going on? And so there was a time when I was a low-level drug dealer and didn't really know what I was doing or why I was doing it exactly, but I quickly was looking for the meaning and trying to understand, why am I wired for this? Why am I really good at this? Why is this just something I seem to understand naturally? I have a natural talent for this. And as I went deeper down the rabbit hole, I started to become aware of what these larger forces were that made marijuana illegal, and what their motivations were. So that drove me to become very passionate about it. But at the same time, I always just, kept pushing even past that. So there was a time when I was really passionate about that, but then that only led me to become more passionate about politics in general, and to just keep going further down the rabbit hole and to understand more and more and more. I'll probably get to that in a different podcast. I probably should have an introductory podcast to my political life. I would say, we got my gang life, my spiritual life, and kind of the thing that kind of brings them all together is really like politics. Spiritual politics, political politics, gang politics. It's how it all comes together. But to be concise and keep on the same subject matter, I'm gonna skip a lot of that and just stay focused on the spiritual element of this. So what ends up happening is I become very educated and aware of very high level drug trafficking. There is no level higher. It's basically the entire cartels flowing tonnage into the United States and trafficking it all over the entire country. And this is a culture. If you live in San Diego, Phoenix, Tucson, Albuquerque, El Paso, San Antonio, Houston, basically all the major cities that are near Mexico have a culture of drug trafficking. Actually every single city has a culture of drug trafficking because the drugs got to get to every city. So there's this culture, and I don't feel like it's really gotten much exposure, which is a good thing. I mean, that's partially why it works and why it's successful. So I'm not trying to expose something to make people get arrested or get caught, doing what they're doing. I feel like the culture is changing. I mean, we have several states have already made marijuana recreational, and we all know where it's going. I mean, it's going to be federally legalized and recreational in our lifetime. And it's only because the tide is turning and we all know where this is heading that I'm starting to feel like, okay, I think it's time that we can start talking about this. We can start talking about the actual politics behind this. Why was it ever made illegal in the first place? And I'm just going to give a quick, I can't help myself. I was going to try to keep the politics out of it, but I'm just going to give a really quick rundown of what I discovered at a very early age when I was really passionate about cannabis. And it was simply that the Rockefellers were trying to create a monopoly of petroleum and wanted to create this whole petroleum-based industry. And so Henry Ford had actually made a Model T out of hemp. And you can find the video footage. He hits the side of the vehicle. He made some type of like plastic or something out of hemp. And you could like hit like the side of the car with a sledgehammer, and it would just bounce right back into the form it was created in, and there would be no dent. And I believe it ran on ethanol, and that was the original Model T. So my understanding is, and I may be wrong about some of these details. Again, let me just disclaimer that I'm not like sitting up here on some pedestal like I have all the facts perfect, but I'm just telling you the reason I ended up doing a lot of things I did and what I discovered and believed, whether they're totally true or not. So some of this is my subjective interpretation, and much of this I do believe is actually what happened. So I believe that the Rockefellers wanted to, through Standard Oil, control and have a monopoly on petroleum. They wanted to partner with the DuPont family to unleash the plastic industry on the world. And I also believe that they wanted to control the AMA and get their hands into the pharmaceutical industry, and they wanted to basically develop drugs out of petroleum. They wanted to develop plastic out of petroleum, and they wanted petroleum to be used as an energy source. I actually believe that they were a huge financier and driver and cause of the Prohibition. And part of what I think the Prohibition was about was making alcohol illegal because it was apparent that the automobile was transforming the world, and Henry Ford's Model T ran on ethanol, which is basically alcohol, which means basically anybody could create the fuel in their garage. Anybody could be empowered to have their own source of fuel. And much like these same controlling powers played this game with Tesla and Edison. Tesla created a free energy system, and Edison figured out, created a system that could be more controlled and monetized. So, what did they do? They ran with Edison's technology and made it so that they could control the energy supply. Very similarly, they did the same thing with petroleum, and I believe that they cut a deal with Henry Ford during the Prohibition to change over his engines to run on their petroleum. And not long after this deal was cut, eventually the Prohibition, also due to a lot of backlash and people not agreeing with it, the Prohibition was lifted and automobiles ran on petroleum. But the same force was behind, making hemp and cannabis in general illegal because it was the biggest threat to the petroleum industry, to the plastic industry, to the American Medical Association and the pharmaceutical industry. So it's really a simple equation. Our greatest problems today with our fake, phony American Medical Association, Food and Drug Administration that are all in cahoots with the pharmaceutical industry oppressing the truth, trying to create a monopoly on truth, and trying to create a reality where their medicine is basically selling us drugs and cutting our body parts off and not allowing anything sane, rational, or natural to prevail. And the reason is because all of that was born from the same people with the same intention, and that's why we have much of the problems we have today. And the entire prison industrial complex and the pharmaceutical industry and all these things, they all were born from the same small group of people and their intention, which was imposed on the rest of us without our full understanding of what was really going on. So this is what I had become aware of at an early age, what I had been willing to go up against, and I became super passionate about how absurd, that basically cannabis, it makes no sense to me that, 18 years old, you can be handed a machine gun and go to a foreign country and kill people, but you're not allowed to drink alcohol. That doesn't make any sense to me either. But it furthermore makes no sense to me that you can drink alcohol, which is super destructive and dangerous, and not smoke weed, which is far less dangerous and has a better track record of people being less violent, less belligerent, and has less negative health effects. In fact, it has mostly positive health effects, on the human body. I don't know that the new strains of weed are going to have the same benefits that the older strains used to have, because now they're, have many times more THC than the original strains did, and they keep cloning them and messing with them. So I can't say that for all weed in general, but as a blanket statement. But prior to us messing with the plant, it naturally was full of many health benefits. Hemp is like one of the most versatile plants in the world. It basically is. It has to be the most versatile plant in the world that can solve a lot of our problems. And basically, if cannabis was legal, we would get rid of most of the prison industrial complex, all the corruption that goes on with the American Medical Association, the FDA, and the pharmaceutical industry, which is a huge part of our entire healthcare problem, if not almost all of the problem, would also, much of that would be remedied. It would basically solve nearly every problem we have and create a new economy that would, help us actually grow and innovate and, hopefully get out of debt and solve, some of our financial problems. So I basically just became super passionate about this, and this doorway is what opened me to all these other things and to really understand at a bigger level how it relates to everything. Now, that said, the major chapters are kind of go through this whole gangbanging initiation stuff, end up in a huge drug trafficking culture, come to have an epiphany about the importance and significance and politics surrounding cannabis and both its legalization and its illegalization. But what changed my life was 9/11. And so I was kind of on this tangent right up until about 9/11. And when 9/11 happened, it completely shifted my life, because I'd already been really going down a path of self-help and self-improvement and self-empowerment and working on myself. And in that journey, I had just come to the point where I was learning about Gandhi, and I just watched the film Gandhi for the first time right around the time of 9/11, and it really spoke to me, the idea of being the change you wish to see, and some, what Gandhi accomplished, that he was able to take down the British Empire, much like the United States did. We share a common history with Gandhi. He was able to destroy the British Empire within India by, sort of through humility. Through being completely vulnerable, he sort of weaponized his own humility and truth, and just embodying the truth to the highest magnitude a human being could possibly embody it. And he was able to overcome, a tremendous challenge and liberate, millions and millions of people. So having that fresh in my mind, when 9/11 happened, I was getting deep into my spiritual teachings, and I was very disappointed at the time. So I was a little naive. I was naive politically, and I was working on becoming spiritually aware. And when I saw George Bush stand on that rubble on 9/11 and say something to the effect of, "You're going to hear from all of us soon," and sort of make a declaration of war, because I was so far into self-help, self-improvement, spiritual understanding, and honestly, I was studying Buddha and Jesus, and all these other teachings I was studying at the same time, but Gandhi was the one who sort of brought it into like a political focal point. And when I was coming from that frame of mind and observing what was happening in our world and how 9/11 had kicked off, and George Bush is declaring, war on, I didn't even know who this guy Osama bin Laden was, and Al Qaeda. I didn't know any of that. I'd never heard of any of this stuff in my life. And naively, I believed at the time, oh, okay, we're going to war with these people. But I saw a spiritual naivety. Instinctively, I felt like these people must be really upset to go through all this trouble, to be living in caves in Afghanistan and go through such great lengths to concoct this plan of using box cutters to hijack these airplanes and fly them into buildings and attack the United States. It was instantly apparent to me that, obviously we've done something to these people. The CIA has done something to completely screw these people over, and lots of people have probably been killed. And so what I didn't like, these are all assumptions. I didn't know any of this as a fact, but that's just instantly, that's what my gut told me, is that, wait a minute, we obviously did something to trigger these people. I don't think that they would go to this great length just out of the random clear blue sky, just because our ideologies didn't reconcile with each other. There had to be a more specific aggravating point that triggered them to go into such an action mode. And so anyway, I instantly knew we must be guilty of something. We have to take some responsibility. It's just like having conflict with your wife or girlfriend or anybody. In any normal situation in life, when you find yourself entangled in deep conflict with somebody, the smartest, most intelligent thing a person can do is instantly take an inventory of themselves and take all the responsibility they can for what they might have done to co-create the situation. Now, I didn't see us do that. For me, it's like, if we would have done that first and then things kept escalating and nobody was letting it down and we just kept being attacked. I'm a pretty reactive person. I'd probably be okay with reacting and responding at that point. But I didn't see us do the spiritually mature thing, which was first take an inventory of ourselves and see, what is it that maybe we've done? Did we do something? What made these people this upset? And because we didn't do that, I instantly was like, okay, well, our leader is very spiritually naive and is not leading spiritually. And this is basically a spiritual, I just instinctively knew we're going to have a clash of civilizations between the Islamic world and Western civilization. I just instantly knew that's where it's going. And therefore, having someone lead us into it that's extremely spiritually naive and ignorant and is just doing basically the opposite of every spiritual teaching we've ever been taught, most specifically, let's just look at, the teachings of Christ or Buddha or, this isn't the way that you should respond spiritually. You should take responsibility first. This said, this triggered me to say, okay, well, our leaders failed us. They aren't doing the right thing. We are going into a spiritual battle, and we have no leadership. I'm going to take it upon myself to be the change I wish to see. And this is what drove me to shoot 30 Nights of Islam, a film, a documentary of me celebrating Ramadan, doing what I can to try to be the change I wish to see, and take an inventory of like, okay, what are we doing wrong? I'm willing to be wrong. I'm willing to go over there and say, okay, what did we do? Like, why did you attack us? Did we do something? Did we kill like millions of people and we don't even know about it because the press and the media and the CIA cover everything up and, spin everything and tell us only what we want to know? Anyone with a little bit of street smarts and a little bit of common sense should kind of have that as a possibility in their mind and work to at least resolve and falsify that possibility before we just keep jumping to conclusions upon conclusions upon conclusions, all based on what might be a totally fallible premise. And so I basically took it upon myself. Like, okay, I'm willing to go into the Middle East and into the Islamic world and be accountable and take responsibility and be willing to be wrong, be willing to hear both sides, and be willing to take responsibility for what we did. My goal is to end the conflict and the war and to not be in this situation. And in order to do that, we've got to take some responsibility. We can't act like we are just like not guilty of anything. I mean, the only way it's ever going to improve is if we take some responsibility and try to work through it and own up to whatever it is that we're doing. So, that said, actually, I'm just going to randomly say this here, and hopefully I can bring it to fruition somehow. But, one of the main people I'd really love to bring on this podcast is actually Louis Farrakhan. Louis Farrakhan is, in the research I've done, essentially the most powerful black man in America next to Barack Obama. And there's millions of black Muslims that are followers of Louis Farrakhan. Louis Farrakhan's a very reasonable person who even agrees with a lot of, not a lot, but even agrees with some of Trump's policies of like common sense. Like, yeah, when the hatred for America is at a street level, you go to Libya or Syria or Somalia or one of these places, the hatred for America is so thick. It just doesn't make common sense to just carte blanche allow thousands and thousands of people to just come here. Like, you've got to realize, like, yeah, there's a lot of people that actually really hate this country and want to destroy it in this part of the world. It's just rational common sense that we got to be discerning. And even Louis Farrakhan agreed with that. So, and even gave Trump a little bit of credit. Now, I think that's amazing. I want to find a way to solve these huge, gigantic problems. I mean, is there a problem greater than the clash of civilizations between the Western world and the Islamic world? I don't think there is, because I don't see it going away. It's just going to keep growing for hundreds of years. This is a marathon. Like, this is a centuries-long battle that we're going to be in if we don't hurry up and get to the root cause and actually do something to try to mitigate it and get everyone to work together and understand each other. This will probably be a whole bunch of podcasts, me just talking about this, because I see it as one of the biggest issues. But in this journey, I shoot this film and I do my best to. What actually ended up happening was I shot the film for the Islamic world. I didn't even really shoot it for Western civilization or anyone over here to even see it. It wasn't even for us. It's for them. It's for me to say, hey, all Americans don't agree with this, like, trying to pretend like we're not guilty of something. I agree that we're probably guilty of a lot. And I also think we need to own it and take responsibility. I will own and take responsibility of everything we actually are guilty of. And I would hope and ask that people in your culture would do the same. I mean, this is the only way things are going to get better. How nobody has come to this conclusion and really taken aggressive action on this, I don't really understand. But I'm happy to be the person to do that if I don't see anybody else doing it. So that's part of what this podcast is to create a platform where we can talk about this and bring these people on and try to work through some of this stuff. So let me give you the insight that I got at the end of shooting the movie, what my insight was. So my intention was to solve this problem, to heal the conflict between the Islamic world and Western civilization. And I was looking for a common denominator, and here's what I found. The common denominator is Abraham. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are known as the Abrahamic religions because Abraham is the common denominator. He's the one who links all of them together. Who is Abraham? So now, again, let me preface this. I'm not on some pedestal thinking I know everything or have all these facts. I could completely be wrong about certain things, but I want to convey what my understanding is of this stuff. In any way you cut it, it's the subjective, symbolic, metaphoric meaning of what I'm saying is the most important thing. So, that said, here is my understanding of the facts. I don't know that these are the facts, but this is what my understanding is from the bit of research I did. I believe that, actually, I'm sorry. Let me preface one thing. I feel like there's probably a lot of people who haven't looked into this stuff too much and don't really care too much, but they kind of agree that, yeah, this is probably a huge problem. And at some point, maybe we should probably do something about this or look at it because it's probably not going anywhere. So for those people, I just want to clarify that there's 5 pillars of Islam, and you have to do these 5 things in order to be a Muslim. And one of the things is to pray to Mecca 5 times a day. But what is it? What's in Mecca? Why Mecca? The place that they're praying to is the Kaaba. And the Kaaba is this spiritual, holy place that they take a pilgrimage to, Hajj, which is another pillar of Islam. And it's this big black stone that has all this, has a whole backstory in itself. But it essentially was the temple of Abraham. So let that sink in a little bit. Muslims are praying 5 times a day to Mecca because it is the holy site of the Kaaba, which was the temple of Abraham. Why is that important? Because Abraham is the forefather of the Jews and the Arabs. This story that I'm about to tell you, for those of you who are not aware of this, is going to be extremely insightful. This is the real reason that the Arabs and the Jews have been at war with each other and fighting in the Middle East since biblical times. And the story goes like this. Abraham is told he's basically going to have the chosen son that's going to be a father of all nations and all this stuff. He's going to basically have this special son, and he's going to father all these people, and they're like the chosen people. So Abraham is a very faithful person who is a total man of God and just completely lives in faith. So he's given this prophecy, this insight that that's what's going to happen, and he believes it. Okay, so he's living his life. He's married to this woman named Sarah, and they're just living out their life, and they're just diligently waiting for this prophecy to come true. But after a lot of time goes by, Sarah's again, this is a fact I'm not sure is true, but something like 86 years old or something like that. And she's still not pregnant. She still hasn't given birth to this child. So she finally says, I don't want to be the reason for why you don't have your chosen child. Obviously, I'm not the person that this was meant to happen through. I'm too old to have a child. I think you should sleep with the Egyptian servant Hagar and fulfill the prophecy. So Abraham eventually says, okay, you're right. I should fulfill the prophecy, and goes ahead and sleeps with Hagar and produces Ishmael. Ishmael is the forefather of all the Arabs in the world. All the Arabs in the world trace their lineage to Ishmael, who was the firstborn son of Abraham. instantly, of course, it seems like, oh, well, there you go. There's the firstborn child, and those are the chosen people. But then all of a sudden, Sarah gets pregnant and ends up having Isaac. Isaac is the forefather of all the Jews. This is the original conflict. Who is the chosen people? And the Jews essentially believe we're the chosen people. Ishmael was born out of wedlock. Ishmael was a mistake that Abraham had a break in his faith, lost faith, and went and had, a bastard child, Ishmael, out of wedlock. And ultimately, he produced a miracle and produced Isaac through Sarah, which is actually the rightful people. This is the original reason they've been fighting since then. And they're still fighting today. And obviously, there's a lot more that's been added to those stories. People like Jesus and Muhammad and other people have come forward since then to really complicate things. But that was the original conflict. And so, let me now give you the amazing Abrahamic story that becomes what I believe to be the common denominator, the common teaching that can hopefully get us all to become humble before this thing everyone calls God and try to get along and not be so dogmatic and aggressive and certain that we're right and that things are going to go the way we say they're going to go. Now, that story is that Abraham eventually is told, this might be the version according to the Jews. I'm not sure if Muslims agree with this story or not, but in any case, God basically tells Abraham, yeah, you did mess up. You created this whole mess, and you're going to unleash this horrible thing because of this, because you lost your faith. You're going to need to go and kill your firstborn son, Ishmael. And so, as crazy as it seems, Abraham was such a man of God that he's going to follow God's will and do God's word no matter what. And keep in mind, as I'm saying this, that the word Islam means submission to the will of Allah, which basically means the most, what Muslims revere as the most powerful thing a person can do is to fully surrender their willpower to God, to be God's will instead of their own will. And so they perceive this act of faith, that Abraham had so much faith in God and put so much trust in God's will over his own will, that even when God asked him to kill his own firstborn child, he was willing to do it because he's just going to follow God's will no matter what. So he takes Ishmael out somewhere in the desert or something to kill him, and basically goes right up to the moment where he's actually going to kill him. And right as he's about to do it, all of a sudden, God says, okay, you don't really need to do it. I was just testing you. Go ahead and sacrifice a lamb or something like that instead. And so he sacrifices a lamb or something like that instead, and is off the hook, and Ishmael is able to go ahead and live and produce all these offspring. Muslims observe that as, or I should say Arabs, but in the Muslim world, this story is observed as one of the greatest acts of faith of all time, that when tested, Abraham was willing to kill his own son if that's what God wanted, and that in the end, God rewarded him with compassion and mercy. That story, that spiritual teaching, to me, is the common denominator to unite the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims under one story, one spiritual teaching, which is simply that even if God tells you it has to be a certain way and is going to be a certain way, and it's prophetic, and the world's coming to an end, and Some of you believe that the Savior will appear for the first time, the Jews, or the Christians believe that like he's going to return, or the Muslims believe whatever it is they believe. They all have this belief of what is going to happen. But here's the thing. God can promise you anything, and God can change his mind and tell you it was just a test. So no human has the authority to say God can't change his mind. God can't test us. God can't say it's going to be this way and then make it a different way. You can't say that. God can do that. God can do anything God wants. God can tell you it's going to be this way and then say, oh, you know what? It's actually not going to be that way. I just wanted to test you and make sure that you were a man of faith or a woman of faith or a child of faith. God has the authority to do that. So as a Christian, as a Muslim, as a Jew, you have to respect that no matter what you think is going to happen and no matter how dogmatic you are about your book, God can still change God's mind and God can say it was all just a test. Okay? So now that we've established that, it's probably a good idea for us to all be humble and get along because we don't know. And it could be, the Jews could be right, the Muslims could be right, the Christians could be right. We could all be wrong. Everybody could be wrong. We don't know. The point is to be humble. We should all be humble before the unknown. Humble before the fact that we actually don't know. Just because a book says it does not mean it has to be so. Even in the book, this story exists. You can be told it's so, and then it still isn't so. And to me, that's the unifying teaching. And I personally actually had some Abrahamic moments. And if you listen to my previous podcast, I talked about how I got initiated into Southside Crips. That was actually an Abrahamic moment for me. I've had a handful of Abrahamic moments where I believed I needed to do something, and I went to do it because my intuition told me, I know, it's essentially like, this makes no sense. This seems completely crazy, but you need to do it. And in my initiation in the Southside Crips, I asked for the highest level initiation you could possibly have. Just to quickly refresh what it was like I could have been initiated. I was 17 years old. I could have been initiated by 17-year-olds jumping me in and had a certain rank. I could have been initiated by 25-year-olds and had a certain rank. I could have been initiated by OGs in their 40s and had a certain rank. Or I could have been initiated by the head of all of Southside Crips out of Los Angeles, and then I'd have an even higher rank, okay? For some reason, my intuition told me, go for the highest rank. Do the craziest thing you can possibly do. I don't know why it told me to do that. I just listened to my intuition. And when the moment came, I had all this time to think about it. I was given the initiation, told what it was going to be. It was very intense. It obviously was way more intense than getting in a fight. And my intuition just kept telling me, like, basically, don't be a bitch, do it. Like, I know it seems crazy. I know it seems like irrational. It seems wrong, but you've got to listen. And that's basically the message I got. So I listened, and I went to go do it. And I intended, like, okay, my intuition's telling me to do this, I'm going to do it. And sure enough, I was let off the hook. I went to show up for the initiation, and the head of Southside Crips basically told this guy who's doing the initiation, he said, hey, if these crazy white boys are crazy enough to show up to the initiation, just go ahead and swear them in and don't make them do it. Obviously, they've got courage. Obviously, they got heart. That's all we really want to know. You've already told me that they have heart. You've already seen them in action, and if they show up to do this initiation, I believe that they do too. So you're good to go. And so that's essentially what happened. I signed up for the craziest, most intense initiation that could possibly happen. I listened to my intuition. I showed up to the initiation, and I got sworn in without actually having to do a single thing. That's actually what happened. And that was just one of my Abrahamic moments. I've also had Abrahamic moments when I believed it was time for me to release 30 Nights of Islam and go into the Middle East and do it. And a similar thing happened where I was let off the hook. I didn't end up having to do it. That was a whole crazy story in itself. I'll try not to tell it in this podcast, maybe tell it in another podcast. So these major threads in my spiritual life are my grandmother teaching me there's only two things in this world, love and fear. That leads me through all this stuff with gang initiation and drug trafficking culture and eventually discovering the political stuff behind cannabis legalization and illegalization. 9/11 happens. I shoot 30 Nights of Islam. I go down this whole rabbit hole trying to be the change I wish to see. I discover the Abrahamic teaching as the common denominator to unite us. And now I want to end. That was kind of a lot. We're at almost an hour mark right now. And now I want to end with, I'm going to take you kind of to another world, and I want to end on this. And just, again, my intention, the whole reason I'm saying all this is not to be on some narcissistic pedestal and just love to talk about myself. I actually don't like to talk about myself. It's taken me years to even come to the place where I was ready to do all this. And my real motivation is to bring people like Louis Farrakhan onto the podcast and to talk about how are we going to resolve this? How are we going to stop the clash of civilizations between the Islamic world and the West? How are we going to do that? We need to start doing something to stop the momentum we already have to destroy ourselves. And so this final piece, I'm going to explain to you a dream I had. How old was I? I was probably about 30, and I'm 39 now. So this was probably about 9 years ago. This dream is what I already kind of had this insight and understanding about the universe, and just kind of already thought in a certain terms. But this dream I had is what like really gave me my full like clarity of how I think the universe works, my spiritual worldview. There's many components to my spiritual worldview, but I think when I explain this, it'll really paint a clear picture of like who I feel I really am and how I got here and what's really going on. So I had this dream, and in the dream, I'm in a farmhouse in probably like Nebraska or something like that. And the lighting is either sunrise, sunset. It's very kind of like twilighty, dark. Like the sun's like kind of there, but not really. It's below the horizon. And I'm in this living room environment. A television's on. There's a guy in a rocking chair watching the TV. It's very dim in the house. And I'm looking at the TV, and it's this old wood box frame TV from like 1980 or something like that. And on the television is this like child, and the child is actually me when I was a child. And I'm like looking at the TV, and I'm looking at the guy, and I'm looking at the TV, and I'm looking at the guy, and then right when I'm just about to ask him, what is this? What's going on? Like, why am I on the TV? Right when I go to say something, he all of a sudden tells me telepathically, the only reason I'm doing this is because if I did it any other way, it'd be too much, it'd be too overwhelming for you. And then, boom, he just all of a sudden whisks me away, and I start flying through worlds like he's the ghost from Christmas Past and taking me on this journey to like show me something. And he starts just downloading me with so much information, just literally lifetimes worth of information in like a nanosecond. And as he's telling me this information, I'm literally incarnating into and living out an entire lifetime where he's trying to explain something to me. So like an example would be, imagine he's trying to explain something to me that happened like during the Persian Empire. Well, while he's trying to tell me, while he's explaining it to me telepathically in a nanosecond, I actually incarnate into a life in that time period, live out an entire lifetime of all these experiences exactly as he's telling them to me. Like this happened, that happened, this happened, that happened. He's rapid fire just explaining everything to me, and I'm actually living out an actual life while he's telling me. And then I pop out and move into the next thing he's talking about, and he's just going at lightning speed. I mean, literally, like each event is happening. I'm like living out a lifetimes in like nanoseconds, and like as I'm doing this, I'm like flying through dimension upon dimension upon dimension upon dimension, and it's like I'm in like an elevator. I'm like going, there's this like feeling like I'm going up and up and up and up and up and up and up, and he's downloading me with all this information, and then all of a sudden, everything slows down, and it's almost like we're arriving at, the floor that we pushed on the elevator or something, and everything stops, And all of a sudden we're like in this whole world and dimension. And in this dimension, there's nothing but pure imagination and there's nothing else. And everyone is just an innocent child of God, and everyone knows that that's all every single being in the entire universe is. Every single being in the entire universe is just an innocent child of God. And all every being is doing is just creating world upon world upon world upon world with their imagination and playing in that world, and that's all that's going on. There's literally nothing else going on in this dimension, in this world. And he tells me, well, before we arrived, he was telling me on the way there, I'm going to tell you who you are, where you come from, and how you got here. Meaning in this body, in this lifetime, as this person, as I'm talking to you right now. And when we get to this dimension, he basically says, this is who you are, this is where you come from. You've never had a break in your continuity of memory in all of eternity until you incarnated into this lifetime. That's the very first time that you've ever had a break in your continuity of memory. You've always understood who you were and how the universe works and how everything is. And this is who you've always been. And he says, now I'm going to show you how you got into this lifetime. And so all of a sudden I go into essentially what he's showing, almost like the past or something. He's showing me what I did. And I'm living it out while he's telling me. And so he's telling it to me and I'm living it out at the same time. And in this experience, I basically become aware that there's this really weird, strange possibility of a universe you can create where there's these weird, abstract, external technologies like phones and computers and cameras and microphones and speakers. I can't even begin to understand what any of this even is. It doesn't even make any sense to me at all. It's why would you need some weird external device to do all these things that we're already doing? We already can do these things. Why do we need these weird things? And so I'm so curious about how this works that I only have one resource. It's creating worlds and playing in them. So I all of a sudden create this world where all these weird external technologies exist, and I'm playing in the world. And in this world, I'm a character in a TV show. It was kind of like Saved by the Bell, for anyone who's ever heard of that show. And it was just basically this cheesy teen TV show, and I was one of the main characters, but there were all these other characters. And there's these weird, basically cameras, recording everything we're doing and sending those images somewhere else where other beings are observing and watching it. And it was very strange and bizarre. It didn't really make any sense to me, but I'm just playing in this world and playing in this world. And of course, I'm having fun and enjoying it. And then all of a sudden, I'm what is that thing? And it's the camera. I'm what is that? And I'm trying to see it, and it's not letting me see it in total clarity and with all the definition of every little button. And I couldn't actually see it. It was out of focus. I couldn't see it completely. And I'm mentally arm wrestling and struggling to force it to show itself to me, and it just will not show itself to me. But I'm determined, and I'm just no, what is it? What is this thing? And I finally just force it to show itself to me. And then the second it shows itself to me, for a split second, I see all the detail and see exactly what a camera is, and then instantly I'm an embryo in my mother's womb. And he says, and that's how you got here. So he ends up telling me a couple more things, which are not really relevant to this podcast right now. And I basically woke up from the dream. And this all made so much sense to me because I'd actually, throughout my entire life, from the moment I was born, my earliest memories, I'm about 2 years old, and I'm staring in a closet mirror, getting my diaper changed, basically drooling on myself. I can't even talk yet. And I'm sitting here having this existential crisis. I'm sitting here going what happened? How did I get here? What is going on? I don't understand what happened. And I'm so disoriented and self-aware that I'm having some form of amnesia. And I start plotting and trying to remember every single event that had already happened up to that moment. And then from that moment through the rest of my childhood, I constantly revisited and would sort of be okay, I was born, and then this happened. I went over here, and then that happened. My mom took me here, and I went over there, and I went to the park, and my sister did this, and that happened, and then we moved, and I went, and throughout my entire childhood, at every age, starting at probably around literally age 2, age 2, age 3, age 4, age 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I'd always go all the way back to the very beginning and try to remember every single thing up to that point, including remembering like these milestone moments where I stopped and went back and recollected my memories. So it was really interesting to me when in this dream, the being literally said, you've never had a break in your continuity of memory in all of eternity. This is the very first time you've ever had a break in your continuity of memory. It all made sense to me because my whole life I've been so aware that I had this weird amnesia, and it felt so unnatural to me, and I've always been struggling to piece it all back together and remember, like, I mean, maybe everyone feels this way, but I definitely felt this way and was like hyper conscious of it my entire life from the earliest memories I have to today. And so anyway, that dream, I think, can kind of give an insight into what my spiritual worldviews are, my cosmology. You know, I basically believe that we're all spiritual beings, and we existed before we came into these bodies, and will exist after we leave these bodies. And this is all just a really quick, maybe test. I don't know if it's a test or not, but kind of feels like it. I definitely think we're very challenged. I think the common denominator and the theme with everything is storytelling. It's just basically storytelling. Act 1 introduced the characters. Act 2 introduced the problem or challenge to be overcome. Act 3, the resolution. So anyway, we cut it. We're all living out the hero's journey and living some story, and that's what we're here to do. We're here to overcome oppression. We're here to overcome a challenge, and we're here to resolve it. But in reality, once we resolve everything, what else is there to do? We're going to probably just go create more problems so we have something to do, especially if we're eternal beings and we've been here forever. And I'm trying to decide if the last thing I should say, I guess I will. And then I'll try to really wrap this up. I didn't know I was going to go here, but I think it's like kind of the last layer. It's like the frosting on the cake. It's like the last piece that I think I need to kind of convey. And I think this will be beneficial to kind of explaining like why I want to work with everyone I want to work with. My goal is to overcome oppression. My goal is to heal ourselves and to heal everything that's broken, and to be humble before God, before the universe, before the unknown, and just be healthy, positive people, you know, humble before the great mystery. And that said, I want to clarify my understanding of like what's going on this planet and why I want to work with all kinds of different people and try to bring about understanding. I do believe, one of the things I believe a little bit of everything. I mean, I believe a little bit of the teachings of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism. I think there's a little bit of truth in everything. That doesn't mean that I don't have like strong convictions about exactly what I believe, because I do. But I also am open-minded and kind of believe that it's almost like everything is almost like truth is a Rubik's Cube. And you got to kind of line up all the colors on each side, and then all of a sudden it just magically all makes sense. And I just feel like there's a way to reconcile everything where everyone's a little bit right. Like, oh, the Jews were right. From their perspective, that is what's happening. And oh, so were the Christians. And oh, wow, the Muslims were too. And so was Buddha. And so I just feel like everyone is kind of right in their own way. And the highest understanding that I'm able to have is to try to put it all together and understand how it all makes sense. And that said, like, I do agree with this concept of a force in the universe that, you know, the Judeo-Christian, Muslim, Abrahamic religions call Lucifer, Luciferian energy, which is like this opposing force. It's the antagonist in our story. And so I do believe historically, politically, what we're really up against, what's really going on, the real human story. And this relates to the G code in the hood. Like, why people are selling crack or smoking crack, and like all the way up the chain to like just mainstream politics and just like what's going on in the world. That general common denominator, whether you're a gangster in the hood or you're some spiritual person, on like a totally non-violent path, like no matter where you are, I do believe that there is a metaphoric antagonist, which is oppressing everyone and causing suffering and confusing us and disorienting us and making us hate each other, making us fight each other. It's the metaphoric, whether it's real or not, it doesn't matter. It's an archetypal metaphor. That's what matters. In the same way that, a firefighter is an archetype of somebody who does that. There is an archetype of an energy in the universe that is causing all the oppression and the negativity and the disorientation and the confusion, and it gives us a challenge to overcome. So I'm interested in overcoming the challenge. I want to be happy and to heal, and for everyone to be happy, and for everybody to win, and for everyone to overcome all the oppression that's on the face of the earth. But I'm like not naive about it. I also realize it's like there's nothing else to do. What are we going to do after we do that? I mean, we're going to be bored out of our minds. So I get it from the highest level that like, we could also just do nothing, or, just be quiet and humble and just wait for everything to happen in front of us and not partake in any of it. I mean, there's many paths we can take. But I do believe that there is a Luciferian energy on the planet, and that this does go back to biblical times. It does go back to Babylon. It is involved in banking. It is this negative force controlling our political body. It is controlling the news and the media, and it's the oppressive force that's on the planet. And I do believe that there are people who are Satanists and Luciferians, and I think that they control Hollywood. I think that they're involved in all kinds of things, and I think that they're more organized than people realize. And I also think that people are super afraid to look at their own shadow, to look at things that they're afraid of. And this is where that teaching of my grandmother saying, hey, there's only two things in this world, love and fear, and one of them is an illusion. I get what she meant by that. It's fear is an illusion and love is all that there is. So what I'm going to break down right now is like, most people are too afraid to look at this. Most people don't want to know that like actually there really literally is Luciferians, actual people who literally want to oppress everyone and disorient everyone and kill people and confuse us, that like, it's actually real. And most people are too afraid to look at it. The implications would be too much. It'd be overwhelming. And so this will probably go over people's head. I'm sure there's people shutting down right now because it's too intense. It's too crazy. It's too overwhelming. But you know what? You're just being a coward if you can't look at it. It's what's going on. I mean, if we're being attacked by an outside invader and they're bombing us and killing us, and it's like when you legitimately have an external enemy or external threat that's actually literally attacking you, it doesn't do you any good to bury your head in the sand and pretend like it's not happening. I mean, you need to take your head out of the sand and stare it in the face and address what's happening. It is what's happening. And that said, that's like just the practical reality. Now, how do I turn that all into the love and fear thing? Well, I actually believe that the highest level Luciferians believe that they have a sacred covenant with God and that they are allowed to oppress and trick and fool and disorient souls. That's their job. They have an agreement. It's just like if we imagine that we wanted to raise money for a worthy cause and we got together and we said, how are we going to do it? Well, let's do it through a play. So we rent out a theater hall and we put on a play and we try to raise money, to help children or something like that. In the play, it's storytelling. Act 1, introduce the characters. Act 2, introduce the problem or challenge or obstacle to be overcome. Act 3, the resolution. You're going to need to have somebody play the antagonist. Somebody's going to need to be the negative thing that you're dealing with that you need to overcome. Somebody has to do that. I do believe that the highest level Luciferians, who are actually at the highest level, who actually kind of have a little bit of love still in them, have a little bit of higher intelligence in them, really do believe that they're kind of jumping on the spiritual grenade, so to speak, and saying, I'll play the antagonist, I'll be the bad guy for this greater cause, because I'm going to create the situation where souls can incarnate and be disoriented and confused and lied to and cheated and betrayed and just be so screwed over that all they can do is go in and grow. And so I do think that at the very highest level, they actually have a reasonably kind of positive intention of what it is that they're doing. And that's where the common denominator love is even still at play in the most dark, horrible thing you could ever possibly imagine. The lower level people, though, the hardcore Satanists, I do believe are basically possessed by super negative energies and forces, and who just love to lie and cheat and steal and kill and just have like a very negative energy about them. And so I think even like the whole Luciferian energy that exists in and of itself obviously has some type of a pyramid structure hierarchy. And the higher you go up, you eventually, I think, do get to that point of like the highest level awareness. But really, obviously, the lower levels are actually just super negative, horrible, like dark energies. And that's really what's going on. So that said, one of my best friends is actually a psychotherapist, and he always says, when he talks about these big concepts like this, he always says, there's the relative world and then the absolute. So there's like these two frames. Like, yeah, in the ultimate reality of things are this way, but in a basic day-to-day way, it's like, I'm tired, I gotta go to bed, I gotta eat, I gotta pay my bills, I gotta take care of my kids. I mean, there's a relative world and there's an absolute, there's the absolute realm. And so what I'm saying is that in the absolute realm, in the highest realm, I do believe that these higher Luciferians think this way. In the relative sense, when we're here on Earth and they're actually doing horrible things, it's another story. It's just basically a dark energy, and it's horrible, and there's nothing great about it. But I do want to. But all that said, I still want to overcome the challenge. I still want to play the game, be happy, be positive, heal myself, see all the people around me heal themselves, take on these huge issues like the clash of civilization between the Western world and the Islamic world, and do something to resolve them. I mean, as well as every other problem we have, like fix the problems in the hood. Get rid of people smoking crack and doing heroin and people doing meth. I mean, I'm not really that fond of these hardcore negative drugs and the amount of people in our culture that are addicts, whether it's alcohol, cigarettes, prescription drugs, like these other hardcore recreational drugs. We have all kinds of problems that I would love to see us heal and come through and become better people. And so that's kind of the point of the podcast. That's kind of the frame. A lot of this, I feel like I've kind of been speaking in the realm of the absolute, but in all reality, I love having my feet on the ground, being grounded, being practical, being in reality, and actually dealing with real shit. That's what I want to be doing. But I think it helps to start from a very clear mind in a larger framework to understand who you are and where you're coming from, where you're going. I mean, what more important information is there to have than who are you, where are you coming from, where are you going, and what are you trying to do? And this is what we're trying to do. The Real Spiritual Gangster podcast is I really want to bridge these two worlds of like the most spiritual to the most gangster, from like the hood to, these conflicts, like the clash of civilizations between the Western world and the Islamic world. Like everything between these two polarities is what I want to address in this podcast. These are the type of people I want to bring on the podcast. And I hope that creates a good enough frame. And I hope that people who do come from more of a spiritual background and listen to everything I just said, I hope that even if you totally disagree with me, if you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist or whatever your frame is, just know that I respect you. I respect your frame. No, we're not. There's no way we're all going to see things the exact same way. It's impossible. We're always going to all see things from a different angle, the way we see them. So I don't want anyone to believe what I believe. My point of saying everything is to disclose and be transparent and say, here's where I'm coming from. That said, I still respect where you're coming from, and I want to find a way to come together and solve common problems and work on these things. So that's it for today. Thank you for bearing with me. It was a little long, but I covered a lot, and I hope it gave you some insight. And stay tuned. I hope you will join us on the next podcast.
If you bring the whole team, I put my passion in a dream.